The leather saddlebag landed on Naomi Atwood's front porch with a heavy, unmistakable thud, and the sound of it jolted her from her chair so fast she knocked her coffee cup clean off the table. She did not need to open it to know. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the same way she had felt the original loss 3 years ago, like a wound that had never truly healed. But she opened it anyway, her fingers trembling as she worked the brass buckle, and what she found inside stopped her breath entirely. Her father's pocket watch, silver-cased and engraved with the Atwood family crest. Her mother's pearl brooch, the one she had been buried without because it had disappeared the same night the Yates gang had ridden through Caldwell, Kansas, and left half the town bleeding. The deed to the mill her father had built with his own hands, the one that had been stolen, and then sold to a man named Cartwright who had subsequently run it into the ground. There were other items too, things she recognized and things she did not, things that belonged to neighbors she would have to visit, and beneath all of it, a single folded note written in a hand that was careful and deliberate, the hand of a man who had clearly learned to write late in life and took it seriously. The note said, "I am returning what was taken. Every item on the list enclosed belongs to someone in Caldwell. I am sorry it took so long. The items I could not physically return are listed with their cash equivalent. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not asking for anything. It was not signed. It did not need to be." Because Naomi Atwood had seen Levi Yates ride into town at dawn, and she had watched him from the upstairs window of the Caldwell boarding house where she rented 2 rooms, watched him ride in alone, watched him dismount in front of Sheriff Calloway's office with his hands already raised before anyone had told him to raise them, and she had pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of that window and felt something enormous and contradictory move through her chest. Levi Yates. The man who had cost her everything. The man whose name had been spoken in this town like a curse for 3 years. The man who, according to every wanted poster from here to Dodge City, had robbed stages, held up banks, and terrorized ranches across 3 Kansas counties before vanishing into the Oklahoma territory like smoke. And now he was back, standing in the dirt outside the sheriff's office with his hands raised, and a look on his face that Naomi could not read from 2 stories up, but that frightened her more than his gun ever could have, because he did not look defeated. He looked resolved. She had gone to that porch expecting to feel nothing but rage. She had brought the note with her thinking she would march straight to the sheriff's office and demand to know what kind of game this man was playing. But she stood there on that porch with the pearl brooch cool in her palm, the brooch her mother had worn every Sunday, the brooch Naomi had told herself was gone forever because men like Levi Yates did not give things back, and she could not make her feet move toward the sheriff's office at all. She sat down on the porch step instead, and she stayed there for a long time. Naomi Atwood had come to Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878, 2 years after her parents had died and left her with a debt-ridden mill, a depleted savings account, and a reputation as a woman who was far too educated and far too stubborn for anyone's comfort. She was 24 years old when she arrived, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with a degree from the Topeka Female Seminary that meant almost nothing in a frontier town where what mattered was whether you could work and whether you could endure. She had proven she could do both. She had fought to hold onto the mill deed through the lean months after her father's death, had negotiated with creditors and sweet-talked the bank manager, and driven that mill herself when she could not afford to pay workers. And then the Yates gang had come through on a Tuesday night in October and taken everything that mattered in under an hour, and the deed had been gone, and her savings had been gone, and her mother's brooch had been gone, and the silver watch had been gone, and the mill had been sold before she could even get to a lawyer. She had rebuilt, because that was what Naomi Atwood did. She had taken a job as a school teacher, rented those 2 rooms above the boarding house, and she had rebuilt herself from the ground up with the particular grim competence of someone who had already lost more than they thought they could survive. She was 27 now, still sharp-eyed, still stubborn, and she had made a version of peace with what had happened. Or she had thought she had. 3 years ago, the night the Yates gang had ridden through, Naomi had not been in the mill. She had been at her neighbor Margaret Hale's house, sitting with Margaret's sick baby, when they heard the horses and the shouting. She had not seen Levi Yates that night. She had only seen the aftermath. The broken lock, the overturned desk, the empty strongbox. She had seen him once after that, entirely by accident, 6 months later on the road between Caldwell and Wellington, when his horse had thrown a shoe, and hers had been the only wagon coming from the other direction. He had been alone, which was unusual for a man who ran with a gang, and he had flagged her down with his hat off and his dark eyes direct and steady, and before she recognized who he was he had said, "Good afternoon, ma'am. I hate to trouble you, but I wonder if you might have a spare horseshoe nail." And there had been something in his voice that was so ordinary, so plain, that she had almost answered him before she placed the face. She had placed the face. She had looked at him for a long moment, this man with the lean jaw and the careful eyes and the hat held against his chest like a man at church, and she had said, "Levi Yates," and he had gone very still. "Yes, ma'am," he had said. "You robbed my family," she had said. "You stole from everyone in Caldwell." "Yes, ma'am," he had said again, and there had been nothing in his face that she could call arrogance or dismissal. He had just looked at her the way a man looks at a verdict he has already accepted. She had snapped the reins and driven past him without another word. She had told herself for 3 years that that was the right thing to do, that it was the only thing to do. And now he was back, and every stolen thing was in a saddlebag on her porch, and she did not know what to do with any of it. Sheriff Roy Calloway was a practical man in his mid-50s who had seen enough of human nature to be rarely surprised by it. But Levi Yates walking into his office with his hands raised, and a written confession in his breast pocket came close to surprising him. He had put Levi in the single jail cell and sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office in Wichita before Levi had even finished talking, because that was what the law required, and Calloway was a man who did what the law required. But he listened first. He was also a man who listened first. Levi Yates was 29 years old, though he looked older around the eyes. He was not especially large, not the kind of man you would single out in a crowd for looking dangerous, but there was a quality of stillness about him that Calloway recognized as the kind that was learned, not born. The kind that came from years of needing to stay very quiet in very dangerous situations. He had grown up in the Oklahoma Territory, the son of a man who ran whiskey and a woman who had left when Levi was 6. He had been running with Thomas Yates, his father's brother, since he was 15, because there had been nothing else and no one else. And Thomas Yates was charming and loud and knew how to make lawlessness seem like freedom, until you were deep enough into it that freedom was just another word for the fact that you had nothing left to lose. He told Calloway most of this, not as an excuse but as a fact, the way you might describe the weather that had been blowing the day a particular decision was made. And then he told him the rest. He had been having doubts for 2 years, small ones at first, the kind you could drink away or ride away from. And then larger ones, the kind that showed up in the middle of the night and would not leave. He had seen things in those 2 years that had accumulated in him like sediment, the faces of people they had taken from, the particular quality of silence that fell over a house after you had emptied it of everything that mattered. He had started keeping a list of everything, of who it had belonged to and what it was worth. And then, 8 months ago, he had ridden away from Thomas Yates and the rest of the gang during a cold night in the Oklahoma Territory, and he had not gone back. He had spent those 8 months working legitimate jobs on ranches and farms across the territory, saving every dollar, tracking down every stolen item he could find, buying back what had been sold, converting to cash what could not be recovered. He had done this quietly and alone, and then he had come back. Calloway looked at the man across the cell bars for a long moment. "You know what the federal marshal is going to want to do with you," he said. "Yes," Levi said. There's warrants from 3 counties. Could be looking at 10 years, maybe more." "I know," Levi said, and he said it the same way he had said everything else, with that settled, accepting quality that Calloway found more unsettling than defiance would have been. "Why come back at all, then?" Calloway asked. "You were gone. You could have stayed gone." Levi was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the window of the cell, which faced east toward the street, though you could not see much from the angle. "Because gone is not the same as done," he said finally. "And I was not done." Naomi brought him a meal that evening, and she did not entirely know why she did it. Mrs. Hale, who ran the boarding house and had been Naomi's closest friend in Caldwell for 3 years, had suggested it with the particular combination of gentle nudging and knowing silence that was her specialty. And Naomi had resisted for approximately 45 minutes before putting on her coat and walking the 3 blocks to the sheriff's office with a covered plate. Sheriff Calloway let her in with a look that was not quite surprised and not quite knowing, somewhere in between, and he took himself into the back room to give the semblance of privacy while still being technically present. Naomi stood in front of the cell and Levi Yates stood on the other side of the bars, and they looked at each other across a distance of about 4 feet that felt considerably larger. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had only recently put it down. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there when she had seen him on the road. His dark hair was longer, and he had a scar along his jaw that she did not remember. He was watching her with those steady, careful eyes that had no arrogance in them and no plea in them either, just a kind of direct, open attention that she did not know what to do with. She set the plate down on the small stool that was the cell's only furniture, pushing it through the gap at the bottom. "I do not know why I brought that," she said, because she believed in saying the truth even when it was uncomfortable. "I do not know why you did either," he said, "but thank you." "I found the saddlebag," she said. "I know," he said. "I left it there." "My mother's brooch," she said, and she had not meant for her voice to catch on those words, but it did just slightly, just for a moment, and she saw something move across his face at the sound of it. Something that was not quite pain but was in the same neighborhood. "I am sorry," he said. "That is not enough." "I know it is not enough, but it is what I have." "Why?" she asked. "Why come back and return everything? You were free. You were gone. You could have lived the rest of your life somewhere else and no one in Caldwell would have ever seen your face again." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I could not live a life that was built on what I had taken from other people. Because every morning I woke up and knew the list of what I owed, and it was a weight I could not sleep under any more." He paused. "And because there was a woman who looked at me on a road 6 months after I had robbed her family and said my name like it was a fact and drove away without another word, and I have not forgotten that look in 3 years." Naomi felt something shift in the center of her chest. She crossed her arms against it. "That is a very interesting reason to walk yourself into a jail cell," she said. "It is not the only reason," he said, "but it is one of them." She left shortly after, because she did not know what to do with any of the feelings that were moving through her, and she was a woman who needed to understand her feelings before she could act on them. She walked back to the boarding house in the cool October evening and sat in her room for a long time with her mother's brooch in her hand and thought about the fact that Levi Yates had said her name in that cell, had not said anything as dramatic as her name, had only implied it with every word, and still the implication had landed somewhere in her like an arrow finding its mark. She was furious with herself. She was furious with him. She was also, underneath the fury, something else, and she did not have a name for it yet, and she was not sure she wanted one. The federal marshal arrived from Wichita 4 days later. His name was Harlan Cross, and he was the kind of man who wore his authority the way other men wore hats, comfortably and without thinking about it. He reviewed Levi's confession, reviewed the list of returned items and the cash settlements, and he met with Levi in the jail cell for the better part of an afternoon. Naomi heard about this from Mrs. Hale, who heard about it from her husband, who heard about it from the deputy, which was how information moved in Caldwell and always had. The legal situation, Naomi gathered, was complicated. Levi had confessed to specific crimes, but he had also voluntarily returned or compensated for every item taken, which was something the law had not entirely prepared for. There were warrants, but some of those warrants were 3 years old and had been issued under circumstances where the evidence was less than perfectly documented. Marshal Cross was, by all accounts, a fair man, but he was also a federal officer with a jurisdiction and a chain of command, and the outcome was not certain. On the 5th day, Naomi went back to the cell. She did not bring food this time. She brought the list of items from the saddlebag, and she had gone through it methodically, visiting each family in Caldwell, returning what was theirs, and she had questions about the items she could not match to anyone. They sat on opposite sides of the bars, Naomi on the wooden chair that the deputy sometimes used and Levi on the cot in the cell, and they went through the list together. It was a strangely ordinary thing to do, and the ordinariness of it was its own kind of strange tension, because there was nothing ordinary about the situation and they both knew it. "The silver candlesticks," she said. "Are those the Hayworth family, the ones on the main street?" "No," he said. "Those are the Burkes from the ranch east of town. They had a pair that had come over from Ireland with the grandmother." "I will take them out there," she said. She made a note. She did not look up. "The money for the Kellerman farm, how did you calculate that?" "Went to the land registry in Wellington," he said. "Looked up the assessed value of the equipment we took. Added interest at 5% per year." She did look up at that. "You added interest." "It was their money earning nothing while I had it," he said simply. That did not seem right. She looked at him for a moment. "You taught yourself to calculate compound interest," she said. "I had 8 months and a lot of motivation," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor but was in the vicinity of it, and she felt the corner of her mouth try to move and she would not let it. "The list is thorough," she said. "I was thorough," he said. He paused. "I wanted to be sure there was nothing left undone." The way he said nothing left undone made her look up at him again, and he was watching her with those steady eyes, and she recognized in that moment that there was a conversation happening underneath the conversation they were having about candlesticks and compound interest, and she was not ready for that conversation yet, so she looked back down at the list. "There is a pocket watch," she said. "Engraved. That one was my father's. I wanted you to know that I found it and that it works perfectly." "I kept it wound," he said quietly. She stopped writing. Her hand went still on the paper. "What did you say?" "I kept it wound," he said again. "While I had it, I am sorry. I should not have had it at all, but while I did, I could not let it run down." Naomi Atwood was not a woman who cried easily. She had cried exactly twice since her parents had died, once at the funeral, and once when she had finally accepted that the mill was gone for good, and she considered herself to have a certain hard-won discipline over her emotions. But she felt in that moment as if something behind her sternum was fracturing very carefully and very thoroughly, and she had to press her lips together and stare at the list until the lines of ink stopped swimming. "Why?" she said when she could say anything. "Because it was a beautiful watch," he said. "And because someone had cared about it very much. I could tell that from how it was kept, and I did not want to be the person who let it stop." She stood up abruptly, gathered the list, and said she would return with an accounting of the items she had already redistributed. She walked out of the sheriff's office quickly enough that she did not quite see the look on Calloway's face as she passed, though she heard him say something quiet that might have been "that girl," or might have been "good Lord," and she did not stop to find out which. Marshal Cross made his determination 2 weeks after his arrival. He met with Naomi and several other town representatives, as the primary affected parties, before he delivered his ruling. The meeting was in the back room of the hotel, which was the most formal space Caldwell offered, and about 12 people crowded into it on a gray November afternoon. The legal reality, Cross explained, was that 3 of the warrants were from Abilene County, which had since changed jurisdictions, and the documentation on those was insufficient for prosecution. The remaining charges from Caldwell and the surrounding area were more substantive, but Levi's voluntary confession, his complete restitution, and the fact that no one in Caldwell had been physically harmed in the original robbery were factors the court would weigh. He was not certain of acquittal, he was clear about that, but he was recommending to the court that Levi's cooperation and restitution be considered substantial mitigating circumstances. He would be transferred to the county courthouse in Wellington for a formal hearing in 3 weeks. When they filed out of the meeting, Naomi stopped and spoke to Cross privately. "Is there anything the affected parties can do?" she asked. "I mean, to speak to the circumstances." Cross looked at her with a steady professional gaze. "A written statement from the affected parties attesting to receipt of full restitution and their recommendation of the court's leniency would be relevant," he said. "It would not be binding, but it would be relevant." "Then I will write one," Naomi said, "and I will ask the others." Cross studied her for a moment. "Miss Atwood," he said carefully, "the man robbed your family." "I am aware of that," she said. "I am also aware of what he did afterward, and I believe both things can be true at the same time." She organized the letters herself. She visited every family in Caldwell that had been affected, showed them the list and the returned items and the cash payments, explained what Cross had told her about the hearing, and asked them to write a statement if they felt the same way she did. Not all of them did. Mr. Kellerman refused flatly, and 2 other families were unpersuaded, and Naomi did not argue with them because she understood their position and it was not wrong. But 9 families wrote letters, some of them brief and grudging, and some of them surprisingly generous, and Naomi bundled them together and submitted them to Cross before the week was out. She visited Levi that evening to tell him what she had done. He did not respond the way she expected. He sat on the cot and looked at her with those careful eyes for a long moment, and then he looked down at his hands. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "It will not necessarily change anything." "I know that too." "Why did you do it then?" he asked, and he was looking at her again, and the question was simple and direct and completely devastating in the way that simple, direct questions tended to be. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the pocket watch, how he had kept it wound. She thought about the saddlebag and the pearl brooch. She thought about the note that had said, "I am not asking for anything," and how that particular disclaimer had stayed with her like a splinter she could not quite find. "Because you told me the truth," she said finally. "You did not try to explain it away. You did not ask me to forgive you. You just returned what was taken and told me it was yours to return and left it at that." She paused. "In my experience, that is remarkably rare." He was very quiet. "I have a dark past, Miss Atwood," he said, and he said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact you have long since stopped being surprised by. "I cannot give you a different history than the one I have. I cannot make it so the things that were done were not done. I cannot be a different kind of man than the one I was." "No," she agreed, "but you appear to be a different kind of man than the one you are now." Something in his face changed. It was subtle, the way his jaw shifted or the way his eyes lost some of their careful guard just briefly, just for a moment. "I am trying," he said. "I do not know if trying is enough." "It is more than most people manage," she said. She stood to leave, and he stood when she stood because that was how he had been, she was realizing, consistently courteous in a way that was not performative but habitual. The manners of a man who had decided at some point that courtesy was something he would not let circumstance take from him. And she found, to her frustration and her interest, that she liked it. She stopped at the cell door. "My name is Naomi," she said, without entirely planning to. "You have been calling me Miss Atwood." "My name is Naomi." He looked at her. "Levi," he said. She nodded. She left. She walked back to the boarding house in the dark and sat with her lamp low, and thought about the fact that she had just told the man who had robbed her family to use her first name, and that she had done it because she wanted him to, and that wanting him to was something she needed to examine very carefully indeed. The hearing in Wellington was set for the 14th of November, 1881. Naomi hired a buggy and drove herself, because she was not a woman who needed to be driven places, and she arrived to find the courthouse smaller than she had expected and more crowded than she would have liked. The Yates gang had been a talked-about operation in the region, and the story of Levi's voluntary return and restitution had spread in the weeks since Cross had arrived in Caldwell, and there were people from other affected towns who had heard about it. She sat in the gallery, which was filling quickly. Levi was brought in from the holding cell with his wrists cuffed, and she noticed that he had cleaned up and that someone had given him a better shirt, and she noticed that the moment he came through the door his eyes moved through the gallery with a steady, systematic quality that was clearly a habit, and she noticed the precise moment when his eyes found her, because he went very still for just a fraction of a second, and then he moved on and took his seat. The hearing lasted 3 hours. The judge was a man named Hartwell, who was older and drier, and had a way of looking at the courtroom that suggested he had heard every possible version of every possible story and was prepared to be interested in none of them. He read the charges with precision. He reviewed Cross's report. He called 3 witnesses from the prosecution's side and 1 from the defense, which was a man named Garfield who had been a circuit preacher in the Oklahoma Territory and who had encountered Levi during those 8 months of restitution work and could speak to his character and conduct during that time. Then he read the letters, all 9 of them. Slowly, aloud, with the particular attention of a man who is weighing each word against its legal and moral context. It took a long time. The courtroom was very quiet. When he was done, he set the letters down and looked at Levi over his spectacles. "The law has prepared imperfectly for the circumstances of this case," he said, "which is the law's problem, not mine to solve here. What I am here to decide is whether the interests of justice are served by incarceration or by the course of action this man has already taken." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not a sentimental judge. I do not believe in redemption as a legal category. I believe in accountability as a legal category, and I am satisfied that this man has held himself accountable more thoroughly than most men in similar circumstances ever manage." He sentenced Levi to 18 months of supervised parole, confined to Caldwell County, with the condition that he continue in lawful employment for the duration. No prison, no transportation. The sentence was met with a murmur in the gallery that was part surprise and part something harder to name. Naomi sat very still. She felt the relief move through her like cold water in summer, and she told herself that the relief was general, that it was the kind of feeling any decent person would have at a just outcome, and she did not entirely believe herself. Levi was brought out through the side door again before she could speak to him, and she drove back to Caldwell alone in the late afternoon light, thinking about the word justice and what it meant, and how it felt in the chest when it actually happened, which was less triumphant than she had always imagined and considerably more complicated. He came to Caldwell 2 days later on his own horse, under the terms of his parole, and he found work at the Tucker livery stable, because he was good with horses, which was something she had not expected to know about him and found herself knowing anyway. He did not seek her out. He was, she thought, being deliberately careful about that, which was either respectful of her need for distance or maddening in its restraint, and she could not decide which. She was the one who sought him out in the end, because she was not a woman who waited for things to happen, and she was tired of waiting for herself to stop thinking about him. She found him at the livery late on a Friday afternoon, working the tension out of a bay horse's front leg with a thoroughness and patience that was very characteristic of him. She was beginning to understand. He was talking to the horse while he worked, low and steady, not words she could hear from the doorway but the rhythm of them, and the horse was standing loose and calm in a way horses stand when they trust the hands on them. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard her, and she watched him and thought about what it meant to be trying to know a person. To be taking the parts that were hard and the parts that were unexpected and the parts that were worse than you wish they were, and deciding to keep going anyway. To keep looking. He looked up and saw her and stood smoothly, not startled, just attentive. "Naomi," he said, and her name in his voice was still something she was getting used to. "I thought you might want to know how the Hayworth horses are doing," she said, which was not what she had come to say, but she said it anyway because it was a bridge and she needed a bridge. "I heard they took to the new feed well," he said, playing along with the fiction of the errand. "They did," she said. She stepped inside out of the late light. "Levi," she said, "I want to ask you something directly and I want a direct answer." "All right," he said. "When you came back," she said, "when you rode into Caldwell with your hands raised and the saddlebag full of returned property, you said to Sheriff Calloway that you were not asking for anything. Did you mean that?" He considered it with the seriousness she had come to expect from him. "Yes and no," he said. "I meant it in the sense that I was not presenting my choices as deserving of any particular reward. I was not returning what I took so that anyone would owe me anything. That part I meant completely." "And the no?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "The no is that there is a difference between what you deserve and what you want," he said carefully. "I did not return what I took because I thought it would earn me anything. But I would be lying if I told you that I did not want to be able to stand in front of you and have you see something other than what you saw on that road 3 years ago." The barn was quiet around them. One of the horses shifted in a stall. Outside, the light was going orange and long, the way Kansas light went in November. "And what do you want me to see now?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "A man who made a mistake that lasted too long and caused too much harm," he said. "And who knows what he owes and has paid what he could pay, and who is not the same man he was." He paused. "And who would very much like, if you were willing, to begin from wherever we are right now and go forward from there." Naomi Atwood looked at him across the warm dust of the livery stable and thought about the 3 years she had spent building herself back from what had been taken, and thought about the pocket watch he had kept wound, and thought about the note that said, "I am not asking for anything," and thought about the way he had said her name in the jail cell the first time like it was something careful and worth handling. "I am willing," she said. "But I want you to understand that I am not an easy woman to know. I have opinions about most things and I express them. I expect honesty and I will not tolerate its absence. I have spent 3 years learning to rely on myself and I will not stop relying on myself now." "Good," he said, and he said it with something that finally, clearly, was a smile. "I would not know what to do with a woman who was easy." Their courtship, if you could call it that, was the most thoroughly observed event in Caldwell since the time the mayor's cow had gotten into the schoolhouse, and that had happened 8 years ago. Mrs. Hale considered it her personal duty to track its progress and report to an interested audience, and the interested audience extended from the boarding house to the general store to the barber shop, without any apparent loss of enthusiasm. What the audience observed was this: Levi Yates, on his days off from the livery, took to walking Naomi home from the schoolhouse in the afternoons. They walked slowly, talking, and occasionally they stopped at the general store for coffee or at the edge of the park to watch the light go off the water tower. They were never more than a foot apart, and they did not touch, but there was something in the quality of their attention to each other that was visible at a distance of a block and a half, which Mrs. Hale had tested personally. What was not observed, because it happened in the privacy of Naomi's 2 rented rooms on a Sunday afternoon when Mrs. Hale had tactfully absented herself, was the conversation where Levi told Naomi about his mother, who had left when he was 6, and who he had spent years trying not to think about. He told it simply, not asking for sympathy, just giving her the information she would need to understand the geography of him. And Naomi listened with the whole quality of her attention, which was substantial, and when he was done she said, "Your father did not protect you," and he said, "No," and she said, "And so you learned to protect yourself the only way that was available to you," and he said, "That is one way to say it," and she said, "I am not excusing it, I'm understanding it. Those are different things, and he looked at her for a long time and said, yes, they are. She told him in turn about her parents, about her mother, who had been a school teacher herself, and who had taught Naomi that a woman's mind was a tool she had an obligation to use. About her father, who had built the mill on nothing but borrowed money and stubbornness, and who had died before he could see it fail, which Naomi thought in her darker moments might have been a mercy. She told him about the 2 years between her parents' deaths and her arrival in Caldwell, which had been the loneliest years of her life, and she had not told many people about those 2 years, and he listened with the same stillness and attention that he gave to everything, and did not try to make it better or explain it, just let it be what it was. They were, Naomi thought, 2 people who had each learned to be alone and who were now discovering what it meant to be less alone, and the discovery was both easier and harder than she had expected. Easier because it was good, genuinely and simply good, in a way she had not anticipated. Harder because it required a degree of trust that did not come naturally to her after the years she had been through. He was patient with her about the trust. He did not push. He did not try to accelerate things beyond the pace she set. And she set a deliberate pace, careful and considered, because she was that kind of woman, and he matched it without apparent frustration. And she found that the matching of it was its own kind of intimacy, the willingness to go at her speed. December came and the Kansas prairie went silver and flat under its first serious frost, and Naomi invited him for Sunday dinner at the boarding house, which Mrs. Hale cooked and served, and then removed herself from with very obvious discretion. It was the first time they had been in an enclosed space together that was not a jail cell or a livery stable, and there was something about sitting across a proper table from each other, with a meal and lamplight and the sound of the fire in the grate, that was its own kind of threshold. They talked through dinner and into the evening, and at some point the topics lost their edges and became less about history and more about preference, about what she thought of the novels she was using for the older children in the schoolhouse and what he thought about horses, which was quite a lot and very specific. He had views on horsemanship that were detailed and interesting, and she found herself genuinely engaged by them, which surprised her, because she had not expected the man's knowledge of horses to be one of the things she would like best about him. When he left that night, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with those careful eyes, and then he said, "Naomi, I would like to ask you something, and I want you to feel entirely free to say no." "Ask," she said. "May I come back next Sunday?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you may come back next Sunday." He nodded. He put his hat on. He walked out into the December night, and she closed the door and stood in the hallway with her back to the wood, and felt something large and warm moving through her chest that she was finally willing to call by its right name. He came back next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the winter moved through its weeks with the steady relentlessness of Kansas winter, and Naomi and Levi found their way toward each other with the same relentlessness, the same unstoppable patient gravity. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday in January, which was not a Sunday, and therefore a departure from the established pattern that surprised her pleasantly. They had been walking back from the schoolhouse, and it had started to snow, the large slow flakes that looked deceptively gentle before they accumulated into something serious. And she had said something about the flakes, and he had been looking at her rather than at the snow, and she had looked up at him and recognized the look and had not stepped back. It was a gentle kiss, exploratory and respectful, and she kissed him back with the same careful attention she gave to everything, and the snow came down around them in the blue Kansas dusk, and when they separated and looked at each other he said quietly, "I have been wanting to do that for some time," and she said, "I know," and he said, "Did you want me to?" And she said, "I kissed you back, did I not?" And he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and she thought she had not heard him laugh before that moment and that it was a very good sound. The months of his parole passed. February turned to March, and the prairie softened into the first colors of spring. the tentative greens, and the early wildflowers that pushed up between the old stalks of last year's growth. Levi had become, in the quiet, ordinary way of things, a part of Caldwell's daily life. He was good at his work at the livery, and horses came from 3 counties to be seen by him when they were difficult or sick, and word of that spread in the way that competence and reliability spread, gradually, and then all at once. There were still people in Caldwell who watched him with a guarded eye, who remembered the October night 3 years ago with a memory that restitution had not fully softened. Naomi understood this, and she did not argue with it, because it was true and their feelings about it were their own to have. But she noticed that the number of those people diminished slowly over the months, not because they were convinced by argument, but because they watched him work and watched him be courteous and reliable and present. And presence was, in the end, the most persuasive argument there was. Kellerman, who had refused to write a letter for the hearing, and who had been the most implacably hostile in the early months, came around in April under circumstances that were not dramatic but were characteristic. His best draft horse had gone lame with something no one in 3 counties had been able to diagnose, and Kellerman had been facing the loss of the animal when someone had told him, grudgingly, that Levi Yates had a way with difficult cases. Kellerman had showed up at the livery on a Tuesday morning with the horse and a face like a closed door, and Levi had taken the horse, diagnosed the abscess that 2 other men had missed, and had the horse sound within a week. Kellerman said nothing effusive or generous when he came to collect the horse. He paid Levi in cash and turned to go, and then he stopped and stood with his back to Levi for a moment and said, "My wife had a necklace, gold chain. You know if that was in the returned items?" And Levi said, "The gold chain was sold at a market in Wichita. I paid cash equivalent. It is in the Caldwell bank account under your name, ready to withdraw." Kellerman stood for another moment without turning around. Then he said, "Right," and led his horse out. He never became a friend, but he stopped being an enemy. And that, Naomi thought, watching from across the street, was what genuine accountability looked like in practice. Not the dramatic transformation of hearts, but the slow, steady, unspectacular repair of broken things. She told Levi this that evening, and he said that he thought she was the most practical and clear-eyed person he had ever known. And she said that this was because she had had to be. And he said that he knew, and that he thought it was one of the most remarkable things about her. And she had looked at him across the table and felt the full weight of his attention, and thought that being fully seen by a person you trusted was one of the finest feelings in the human experience. He asked her to marry him in May, when the prairie was fully green and the wildflowers were running riot, and the sky over Caldwell was that particular pure blue that only Kansas did in spring. He did not do it on a Sunday, and he did not make it theatrical, which she appreciated. He did it on a Tuesday evening in her rooms, at the end of a quiet supper, with a ring that she could see he had saved for and chosen carefully, a simple band of gold with a single small turquoise stone that was the color of that perfect Kansas sky. He said, "I want to build something with you. Not because I deserve to, and not because it would change what came before. Because you are the person I want to build it with, and I think we could build something worth having." Naomi looked at the ring and looked at him and said, "Yes," without hesitation, because she was a woman who examined things carefully before she decided, and she had been examining this for 6 months, and she was sure. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, the turquoise warm against her skin, and then she looked at him, and he was looking at her with an expression she could only describe as the look of a man who has received something he was not certain he was allowed to want. And she thought about everything he had done to be worthy of this moment, every item returned and every mile traveled and every dollar saved and every truth told, and she felt, with great clarity, that she was not making a mistake. They were married in the Caldwell church on a Saturday morning in June of 1882, with the windows open to let in the summer air and the whole congregation present. including several people who had come primarily out of skepticism and who left having witnessed something that gave them pause in the best possible way. Mrs. Hale cried with great enthusiasm and made no apology for it. Sheriff Calloway stood in the back with his arms folded and a look on his face that was somewhere between dignity and deep private satisfaction. Naomi wore her mother's pearl brooch. They moved into a small house on the eastern edge of Caldwell that they rented while Levi saved for something more permanent, and they set up their shared life with the same deliberate, careful attention they brought to everything. She continued to teach. He continued at the livery, and by August he had enough saved and enough reputation established that he negotiated a partnership with old Tucker, who was 65 and glad to have someone to share the work. The house was small but had good windows and a kitchen garden that Naomi attacked with an enthusiasm that surprised even her, and they spent the long summer evenings on the back step drinking coffee and watching the light go off the fields in that particular way it did in Kansas, where the sky was so enormous that the sunsets were practically architectural. She told him in those evenings more of herself than she had told anyone. He told her more of himself in return. They argued sometimes, because she had opinions and he had opinions, and some of their opinions did not overlap, and the arguments were fierce and honest and generally resolved by the kind of conversation that was only possible between two people who respected each other's intelligence enough to actually engage with it. He had never been with a woman who argued with him in good faith and found the experience bracing in the best possible sense. She had never been with a man who did not eventually treat her opinions as something to be managed rather than engaged with, and the difference was significant. Their first winter together was the winter of 1882 to 1883, and it was a hard Kansas winter, the kind that comes down in October and does not leave until late March, and in between does its level best to remind you who is in charge. The livery work was constant in that kind of weather, horses needing more care, more attention, more everything, and Levi worked long days and came home cold and tired, and she had learned by January to have a hot meal waiting and a fire built up, not because she felt obligated to do it, but because she had discovered, to her interest, that taking care of someone you loved was different from any other kind of obligation, lighter and more particular. He was good to her in the ways that mattered. He was present, he listened. He did not treat her work as less important than his own, which was not something every man in 1882 Caldwell could have managed, and she was aware of the rarity of it and grateful for it. When she had a difficult situation at the school, a child with a hard home situation, a parent who challenged her judgment, he engaged with it seriously, asked questions, remembered the details the next time she mentioned it. He treated her life as something worth paying attention to. By March, she told him she was expecting. She told him matter-of-factly, because she did not know how else to tell things, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that she wished she could have captured and kept: the initial stillness, the dawning understanding, and then something that was so nakedly joyful and so openly unguarded that she had to look away for a moment because it moved her almost past her own capacity to handle it. "Are you all right?" he asked, when he could ask anything. "I am very well," she said. "You can stop looking at me as if I might be breakable. I am not breakable." "No," he said, "you are emphatically not, but I would like to be allowed to be cautiously attentive anyway." "You may be cautiously attentive," she said. "Within reason." He was, characteristically, very good at the within reason. Their son was born in November of 1883, which meant he was a Kansas winter baby, which Naomi considered fitting. They named him Daniel for her father, and he had Levi's dark hair and Naomi's sharp, clear eyes, and he came into the world at about 4 in the morning with a directness and intention that Mrs. Hale, who assisted with the birth, said was clearly his mother's. Levi was present for as much of it as was allowed and appropriate for the time and place, which was not all of it, but was enough that when Mrs. Hale finally called him and he was sitting in the hallway with his elbows on his knees and the expression of a man who has been conducting a very intense private negotiation with the universe. When she put Daniel in his arms, Levi was quiet for a long time. He looked at his son with the full, careful attention he gave to everything, and she watched him from the bed and thought that she had never seen him look afraid before. Not really, not genuinely, not even in the jail cell or the courtroom. But he looked a little afraid right now. The tender, enormous fear of a person who has been given something they did not believe they would ever have, and are overwhelmed by the responsibility of it. "Hello," he said to Daniel very quietly. "I am your father. I will do my best by you. That is my promise." Daniel, for his part, seemed satisfied with this assessment and went to sleep. In the years that followed, Levi bought out Tucker's share of the livery entirely, when Tucker retired in 1885, and the business grew steadily as the town grew and the rail connection through Wellington expanded, and people came in greater numbers to the region with more horses and more needs. He hired 2 men to help him, and by 1887 he had expanded to a second location in Wellington itself, and the dark past that had cost him so much was so thoroughly overlaid by the present he was building that new people coming to Caldwell who asked about Levi Yates were told he was the best horseman in 2 counties, and that his wife taught school and his children were a credit to the town. And the part about the warrants and the gang and the old saddlebag of returned stolen goods was something they might or might not hear about eventually, depending on who they asked. He talked to Daniel about it himself, when Daniel was old enough. He sat down with his son on the back step of the house they had finally built on a proper lot, a real house with 4 bedrooms and a good kitchen and a parlor with a window that faced west, and he told him the truth about who he had been and what he had done to try to make it right. He told it plainly, the way he told everything, without self-pity and without drama, and Daniel listened with his mother's sharp attention and then said, "Were you scared when you rode back in?" And Levi said, "Yes, very," and Daniel said, "But you did it anyway." And Levi said, "The things worth doing are often the things that scare you most." Daniel thought about this with great seriousness. "Is that why you married Mama?" he asked. "Because she was scary?" Levi looked at his son and then looked across the yard to where Naomi was in the kitchen garden doing something brisk and competent with the bean steaks. "Yes," he said, "partly. Naomi gave birth to their daughter in 1886. They named her Clara, and she came out with opinions about everything immediately and seemed unlikely to change this approach. She was devoted to Daniel in the particular way of younger siblings who are also, constitutionally, the dominant personality, and Daniel managed her with the patient bemusement of a boy who had spent a lot of time learning how to manage formidable women by watching his father. Life in Caldwell was not without its difficulties. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was brutal across the entire Great Plains, what people later called the Great Die-Up, and the cattle ranches in the region suffered catastrophically. The livery was not directly affected by the cattle losses, but the ripple effects through the local economy were significant, and there were families that winter who were in genuine distress, and Naomi and Levi were among those who organized the practical response, food distributions and fuel sharing, and the particular kind of neighbor-to-neighbor assistance that frontier communities had always depended on. Levi worked through that winter with a ferocity of effort that she recognized as characteristic, doing whatever was needed wherever it was needed, sometimes at considerable personal cost in terms of time and sleep and energy. She did the same. They were both, she thought, people who responded to hard circumstances by working harder, and it was one of the things they had recognized in each other very early, and that bound them together in a particular way. In the spring of 1887, when the worst was over and Caldwell was beginning to recover its equilibrium, they sat on the new house's porch on a warm evening in April, and she looked at the man beside her, who was 5 years older than when he had ridden into Caldwell with his hands raised, who had gray at his temples now and laugh lines around his eyes and calluses on his hands from honest work, and she thought about everything the word returned meant. Returned, the pocket watch, the pearl brooch, the mill deed, the candlesticks, the cash for the necklace, all the material things he had taken and brought back. But also himself. He had returned himself, from wherever he had been in those years when he was Thomas Yates' nephew, and the darkness was the only way he knew. He had brought himself back from that. Not to the person he had been before, because there was no before worth returning to, but to someone new, someone that the return had made possible. She reached over and took his hand, which was not something she did always, because she was not an always kind of person, but she did it now, and he turned his palm up immediately and closed his fingers around hers with the ease of long practice. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "You," she said, "and how far we are from where we started." He looked out at the April evening, the greening fields, the enormous Kansas sky beginning to purple at the edges toward the west. "Is that a good thing?" he asked, though she could tell from his voice that he already knew the answer. "It is the best thing," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was a habit he had had since before they were married, and which she had never told him she loved because she was not always easy about saying that kind of thing. But she loved it. She loved the warmth of it and the gentleness of it, and the way it said without words that she was something worth caring for. "I want to tell you something," he said, still looking at the evening. "Tell me," she said. "I was not a good man," he said. "For a long time, I was not a good man and I did harm and I cannot take that back. I know that. I know there are people who will always know that about me and I cannot change their view of it and I should not try." He was quiet for a moment. "But I want you to know that every day I have spent with you, every day of this, of the house and Daniel and Clara, and the work and the arguments and Sunday dinners, and the whole plain, ordinary fact of being your husband, that has been the best thing in my life. The best thing I have ever managed to be part of. And I want you to know that." Naomi looked at his profile, the lean jaw and the careful eyes and the gray at his temples and the scar along his jaw from some old trouble she had stopped needing to think about, and she thought about the word managed, that he had managed to be part of this, that this was something he had chosen and worked for and returned himself into being worthy of, or as worthy as any person could make themselves of anything. "I know," she said. "And I want you to know that the choosing goes both ways. I chose you too. I chose you knowing the full account, the dark parts and the restitution and everything between. I chose you because you were honest with me and because you kept my father's watch wound and because you made me laugh in a jail cell, which is not something I had expected to find appealing." She paused. "I chose you because you looked at me like you were actually seeing me, not what you wanted me to be or what was convenient for you, like actually me. And that is, it turns out, a remarkable and rare thing." He looked at her then fully, with all the attention he had always given her, and she met it without looking away, because she was the woman who drove away from him on a road and then spent 3 years not forgetting it, and she was the woman who had decided with her eyes open to let him back in, and she had never once regretted it. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. She did not say it simply or easily, because she was not a simple or easy woman, but she said it with the full weight of everything she was and everything she had decided, and he knew that because he knew her, and the knowing was mutual and complete and very good. Spring went on doing its work around them, methodical and certain, the way spring did in Kansas when it finally arrived, turning the long brown of winter into something luminous and green, field by field and hour by hour. The prairie did not make the transition gently or all at once. It did it in pieces, in fits and starts, one corner at a time, until suddenly you looked up and everything was different from how it had been, and you could not quite say when the change had happened, only that it had. In 1889 their second son arrived, and they named him Joseph, and he was a red-faced, determined baby who slept 4 hours at a stretch from birth, and seemed to have decided that the world was an interesting problem he intended to solve. He had Naomi's stubborn chin and his father's careful eyes, and the specific combination of those things, as Daniel pointed out with some authority, was going to be a considerable experience. Daniel, at 6, had opinions about the new baby that were generously shared with anyone who asked, and several people who did not. Clara, at 3, had opinions about everything and was primarily interested in whether the baby's arrival would affect the distribution of attention in her direction, which she monitored with the precision of a small and thorough auditor. Levi watched his children with a wonder that had not diminished in the years of their existence. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, not loudly affectionate, but he was present and he was attentive, and he showed up to the particular obligations of fatherhood with the same reliability he brought to everything else. And his children knew this and trusted it, and the trust was something visible in how they moved around him, easy and secure. The way horses moved in the presence of a handler they knew was steady. Naomi watched him with them and felt something she could only call gratitude, the specific and deeply felt gratitude of a woman who had wanted, under all her competence and self-sufficiency, someone to build a life alongside, and who had found that person under the most improbable of circumstances. She still wore the turquoise ring, and she still wore her mother's pearl brooch on Sundays. The pocket watch sat on the mantelpiece in the parlor, wound and running, as it always had, as she had learned it always had even during the years it had not been hers. She thought about that sometimes, the watch running through the years it had been absent, keeping the same steady time regardless of where it was or who was holding it, and she thought it was a good image for something, though she was not always sure what. Levi had stopped by the mill on the eastern road once, the one that had been her father's and that had been sold and run badly and eventually shut down. The building was still standing, the water wheel stopped and the wood going gray, and he had stood looking at it for a long time and she had been with him. It would take some work, he had said, but the structure is sound. The wheel mechanism is old but repairable. She had looked at him. "Are you suggesting something?" she had asked. "I am observing something," he had said carefully. "What you do with the observation is your affair." She had laughed at that because it was so entirely him, this man who learned to tread carefully around her independence and had become very good at it. "I will think about it," she had said. She had thought about it for 2 years. In 1890, she had purchased the mill, and the land with the savings she had accumulated from 8 years of teaching, and the money from her mother's estate that she had never fully spent. She had gotten the structure repaired and the water wheel replaced and the mill running again, not as a grain mill this time but as a lumber operation, because the region's building boom made lumber more valuable than grain and she was practical. She ran it herself for the first year, with a manager on site, and it was profitable within 18 months, which was faster than even her most optimistic projection. Levi's contribution to this was primarily the hauling contracts he negotiated through the livery, which were worth more than she initially calculated, and a series of connections he had developed in Wellington that gave the mill access to a market she would not have had otherwise. They did not merge their businesses formally because she was not interested in merging anything formally, but the complementarity of them was a fact and they both acknowledged it. "You are, it turns out, quite useful," she told him. "I try to be," he said, with the gravity of a man paying serious attention to a compliment. The mill meant that she could afford to give up the school teaching, but she did not. She reduced her hours to accommodate the additional work, but she stayed with the school because she believed in it, and because the children in Caldwell deserved a teacher who cared about what she was doing, and she cared about what she was doing. She would do both for another 6 years, until Clara and Daniel were old enough to take over some of the administrative work of the mill, and she could shift her attention appropriately. The year 1893 brought another hard stretch, the economic panic that swept the whole country, and Caldwell was not immune. The livery survived on reduced margins, and the mill pulled through, because timber was still needed even when money was tight. But it was a lean 2 years, and Naomi and Levi navigated it with the same combination of practicality and determination that had characterized their partnership from the beginning. On the far side of the lean years, in 1895, they had what would be their last child, a daughter they named Margaret, after Mrs. Hale, who had been Naomi's friend through every stage of this long story and who cried when she heard the name with the same enthusiasm she had brought to the wedding and every significant event since. Margaret was a calm and thoughtful baby who observed the world with large dark eyes, and who, Naomi thought, was going to be the kind of person who did not say much but missed nothing. She was right about this. Levi turned 40 in 1892, and they marked it with a dinner that was larger than either of them intended, because the guest list, when they made it, turned out to encompass an improbable number of people from both their lives and the lives of their children. And the house could not contain it, so they moved it to the yard and borrowed tables from the church hall, and Mrs. Hale organized the food with military precision, and the evening went long and warm and very good. Looking around that table, at the faces of Daniel and Clara and Joseph, and the collected people of Caldwell who had become, over 13 years, the texture of their daily life, Naomi thought about where she had been at 24, alone with a debt and a loss and a future that had looked like a locked door. She thought about the woman who had driven past a man on a road and refused to see him as anything other than what he had done, and how that had been the right choice then, and also not the whole story. She thought about the saddlebag on the porch, the particular thud of it, and the way she had known before she opened it that something was going to change. Levi was across the table, talking to Calloway, who was 60-something now and had retired from the sheriff's position the previous year, and had become, in retirement, even more the kind of laconic, observant presence he had always been. He was gesturing with his fork at something, making some point with the quiet emphasis he brought to points he considered important, and Calloway was listening with his arms folded, and his characteristic expression of a man who is deciding whether to be convinced, and Naomi watched her husband and felt the full, uncomplicated weight of loving a person who has become essential to your life. She caught his eye across the table. He saw her watching him and raised one corner of his mouth in the small, private expression that was for her alone, the one that said, "I know you are watching me and I am glad you are." She looked back at him with the full force of her steady, particular attention. He looked at her with the same. It was, she thought, everything a person could reasonably ask for, to be fully seen by the person you loved, and to see them fully in return without illusion and without the need for any. Daniel left for Kansas City in 1896 to study at a mechanical engineering school there, because the mills and machines of the industrial age fascinated him, and he had his mother's practical intelligence and his father's instinct for how things worked, and both parents watched him go with the same complicated pride that is equal parts joy and something that resembles loss but is not. He would come back, and often, but Caldwell was no longer the whole frame of his world, and that was as it should be. Clara had taken up the mill management with a thoroughness that Naomi recognized as her own habits expressed through a completely different personality, all noise and decision, where Naomi was quiet and considered, but arriving at the same rigorous outcomes. She was brilliant with numbers and had a trader's instinct for contracts, and by the time she was 15, she was in every meaningful sense running the administrative side of the operation, which freed Naomi in ways she had not anticipated. Levi took her on a trip in 1897, the first time either of them had traveled more than a day's ride from Caldwell in 15 years. They went to Denver, which was a city of a size and character that Caldwell could only approximate, and they stayed in a hotel with a proper dining room and walked in streets wide enough for 4 carriages abreast and saw things they had read about but never seen. And it was good. It was very good to be two people who had built a life together and could take it out of the context of that life and find that it still worked, that they were still interesting to each other in a new landscape. In Denver, she bought books she could not get in Caldwell, and he looked at the horses in the city stables with a professional eye and made observations she found both characteristic and fascinating. They went to a concert one evening at a music hall, which was not something either of them had done in years, and she sat beside him in the dark and listened to a string quartet play Beethoven, and felt the music move through her in that particular way music did when you were already full of something, and it found the fullness and made it overflow. She took his hand in the dark. He turned it palm up and closed his fingers around hers. They came home to Caldwell on a Friday afternoon in late October, nearly 20 years now since the first October when the saddlebag had landed on the porch, and the whole impossibility of the story had begun. The prairie was in its late autumn colors, the golds and browns and silvers of a Kansas fall, the sky that enormous clean blue that did not diminish regardless of how many years you had looked at it. Their house sat where it had always sat on the eastern lot, the kitchen garden put to bed for the winter, the smoke beginning from the chimney where Joseph had gotten the fire going, 15 years old now and reliably in charge of the house in their absence. Margaret, 8, would be home from school. Clara would be at the mill. Daniel was in Kansas City. Levi pulled the buggy up in front of the house and set the brake, and they sat for a moment before getting down, as they sometimes did, in the way of people who have learned to be still together, to let a moment be complete before moving to the next one. "Tell me something," she said. It was a thing she said sometimes without preamble, just as an invitation for whatever he had on his mind, and he always had an answer. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the house. "I think about who I was before," he said. "Not often, less than I used to, but sometimes." He paused. "And I think about what it cost me and what it cost other people. And I am sorry for that, always. I will always be sorry for that. But I also think about the fact that coming back was the best thing I ever did. That choosing to return and be accountable and face what I had done gave me everything I have now." He looked at her. "You gave me everything I have now, which is the most improbable and the best thing that has ever happened to me." Naomi looked at him, this man with his gray temples and his steady eyes and the 30 years of living in his face, and she thought about improbable and best. About the saddlebag and the note and the jail cell and the turquoise ring and the years that had followed, all of them, the hard ones and the easy ones and the ones that were both at once. "Do you know what I think about?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "A pocket watch," she said. "That was kept wound while someone else had it, because it was beautiful and someone had cared about it very much." She met his eyes. "That is when I knew," she said. "That is the moment. When I knew you were not the man I had decided you were." He looked at her for a long moment. "And who was I?" he asked quietly. "A man trying very hard to be worthy of something," she said. "Even before you knew what that something was." He reached over and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face, a gesture so practiced and so familiar that she did not think he was conscious of it, just the habit of 15 years of tending to her in the small and specific ways he knew she would accept. "Naomi," he said. "Levi," she said. They got down from the buggy together. She took his arm and he opened the gate, and they walked up the path to the house where their children were, where supper would be getting started, where the fire was burning and the lamp was lit in the window, and the October light was long and gold across everything. And it was, as it had been for many years and would be for many more, exactly the life they had chosen and built and kept, the life that had been made possible by a man who came back and told the truth and returned everything he had taken, so that he could stand taller in the eyes of the woman who had made him want to deserve it. The watch was on the mantelpiece, wound and running. The brooch was in the bedroom, ready for Sunday. The deed to the mill was framed on the parlor wall, because Naomi had put it there herself the day they reopened it, the original deed in her father's name, which she had transferred to her own on the day of the purchase, and which meant what it had always meant, that the Atwoods had built something and that it had endured. Inside the house, Joseph called out that they were back, and Margaret ran to the door with the specific loud energy of an 8-year-old who has been waiting. And Clara was coming up the road from the mill direction, with the long stride she had inherited from her father and a ledger book tucked under her arm. And the ordinary, beautiful, specific fact of all of it, of this family, and this house, and this life in this particular place, settled over Naomi Atwood Yates like the kind of warmth that comes from inside a thing and does not depend on the weather. She looked up at Levi on the step of their home. He looked back at her, and they were, as they had been for 15 years and intended to be for all the years after, exactly where they were supposed to be.